Good afternoon and welcome. I'm broadcasting today from my home studio, and I'm delighted to welcome Mark Anderson. Mark speaking to us today all the way from Texas. And over the years, Mark has produced some really excellent material, in particular, analysing what's been happening with global cities or the movement towards global cities, but also looking at the power base of the organisations that are helping to drive that agenda. Organisations such as the World Economic Forum, Transatlantic Council, Trilateral Commission. There's almost too many of them to name, but they're all working away in the background. Mark, welcome.
Great to be here, Brian. Always enjoy it.
Excellent. Okay. Well, just for our British audience, please tell us where you are in Texas to give us a bit of a feel for the geography.
Oh, I'm in far South Texas, near a town called Donna, which has been on the world map lately because it's the home of a very controversial illegal alien detention center, not a half mile from my house here. So it's near the Texas border, subtropical climate, and I spend my winters here.
Right, okay, excellent. And all of the troubles of the frozen north, which you had in Texas, that's all gone. Have people in Texas sort of recovered from that experience? Has life gone back to normal, or is it still a bit strange?
Other than the Corona task force and the Corona tyranny that's going on, yeah, the storm thing is pretty much in the rearview mirror of Texans. But now we got to deal, just like they do in the UK, just like you do in the UK, with this virus regime, this COVIDocracy that's growing up, and the global cities movement that you alluded to, I've been covering a long time, is at the forefront of pushing the vaccination regimentation society.
Yes. Well, inevitably, we're going to end up talking to some extent about the COVID-19 so-called pandemic. On the UK column news today, Mike Robinson and Patrick Henningsen were talking about what we can clearly see as a visible move towards a dictatorship here in the UK. And of course, one of the key mechanism at the moment to get in that position is the creation of fear of this so-called pandemic. And it's very obvious that people in UK are now being attacked by their own government, and that government is using applied behavioural psychology to make people very fearful and control them. But we can come on to that a bit more. Now, you were very keen to speak on the subject of global cities, and this is a really important topic for people to listen into, because ultimately we see this as where the world's political system is heading. And over the years, the UK column has covered a lot of material, some of it from yourself, obviously, Mark, but on screen, I just thought I'd call up some of the titles of articles. We've got mayors usurping nation states in the quest to fight climate change, distraction politics and the long march towards global government. We've got the regionalisation process. We've got in pursuit of fairness, one world governance, a common purpose, and the Resilient Cities programme, another threat to individual liberties. And we've also got a global parliament of mayors and the abolition of the electorate. And I think that last title seems to fit very much with the theme that you've got in the article that you've sent through to us. So really the floor's yours, Mark. You've produced this paper taking us through recent events in March 18, where there was the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. That sounds a very grand title. Tell us what it was about.
Yeah, March 18th, just this past March 18th, 2021, was the first virtual meeting of this calendar year, sponsored by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's their Pritzker Forum on Global Cities. Pritzker is the Hyatt hotel family out of Chicago, a Jewish family who boasts J.B. Pritzker currently as the governor of Illinois. And they've put a lot of money into this forum on global cities, as has the Lester Crown Fortune, which is General Dynamics, a defense contractor, and a little bit from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, which is ironic because the namesake of that foundation was the populist, nationalist, anti-globalist publisher of the Chicago Tribune, Robert Rutherford McCormick, who died in 1955. So to use his legacy and his foundation to fund globalism is more than ironic. But moving on from that, the March 18 meeting, like the October 20 meeting last year, the October 2020 meeting, I should say, these are the first two virtual meetings they've had amid this Corona society we're living in. So now they've gone virtual. And instead of having one big confab a year, the Global Cities Forum started in 2016 in earnest, and they were having one big confab every June. But instead of doing that now, starting last October and now earlier this month in March, now they're having the virtual forums. So now they're breaking it up into smaller forums and having them more frequently. The next forum will be in just a couple of months, I understand, something like that, May or June. So now with the March 18, 2021 meeting, Evil Dulder, the president of the Chicago Council, who's a U.S. envoy to NATO, he introduced all the speakers, and it included Marvin Rees, the mayor of Bristol, UK, Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, Latoya Cantrell, the New Orleans mayor, Eric Garcetti, very notable there, the Los Angeles mayor, and a South African mayor as well, along with Pete Buttigieg, the former presidential candidate on the Democratic side, who became the first openly homosexual Secretary of Transportation under Biden. That's his own proclamation. He makes a big deal of that. Among a few other sundry guests, but the meeting covered a lot of ground, but the main thing that it focused on was pushing this vaccine regime with a completely monolithic narrative, no dissent allowed. And you've got guest health officials like Marcela Nunez-Smith, who was interviewed by Ed Luce of the Financial Times. She was among the speakers and interviewees throughout this approximately 2.5 hour virtual Zoom Global Cities Forum back on March 18th. And she talked a lot about what many of them commented on, and that was there's this race and place thing where they want to make sure that these vaccinations, which they believe are unequivocally good, there's no chance that they have any dangers or hazards in terms of what's in them and things like that. They want to make sure that the vaccines are very quickly and equitably distributed throughout American society, meaning that Black and Hispanic neighborhoods that are perceived as getting more cases of COVID allegedly, and allegedly having more COVID deaths in these minority parts of society, then those parts of society should get the vaccines faster and in a very, very efficient way. There's this notion that if that doesn't happen, that white communities will get the lion's share of the vaccines and benefit more and leave the minorities behind. And then on the international level, Garcetti steps in, the LA mayor, and says, well, what's true within cities is also true internationally. We can't have poor countries being denied these wonderful, tremendous vaccines that provide all this, unquestionable protection. So there's this redistribution of the wealth kind of mentality where you can't have single nations going way ahead of other nations and taking the lion's share of the vaccines, nor can you have majorities within cities getting the lion's share of the vaccines and leaving minorities behind. So there's this obsession with everything being very quickly rolled out, everybody being included, and they called the overall March 18 Global Cities Forum Pursuing Equity. And equity to them is you can't have any vaccine nationalism. That's a big term for them. That means rich nations are hogging the vaccines and getting the lion's share of these supposed miracle serums. So this is the human rights angle, you might say, the equity angle that was predominant in that March 18, 2021 Pritzker Forum on Global Cities panel discussion. So that was the underpinning of it, Brian.
Okay, just to come in there, Mark, just for taking on board where you are going, absolutely. Just for people who maybe have not really come across this concept of the growing power of mayors across the globe and what is coming with it, a movement towards the city-state. I on screen just a search as somebody might do for global. I put in global and mayors, and up comes the Global Parliament of Mayors. I've got the Global Covenant of Mayors. I've got Bloomberg Cities, the Global Mayor Challenge. So if we do a simple search on the internet, it's clear that there is a massive movement towards giving cities power. And if you're giving a city a power, who's going to take that power? Well, it's going to be the mayor, and it's going, in UK we would call it the city council, the local authority, the local government. That would be the thing that gets the power. And so the mayors, we didn't really put much importance on mayors in UK until we got involved with the European Union, and then this more European system where the mayor is a revered figure and holds power to do things. That started to migrate across in UK. So we've seen a significant change with the fact that our cities have gone from being democratically run to an increasing drift towards a sort of autocratic system with a mayor. Where, get you to answer this, where are you seeing this movement coming from? If we had to pin it down, you've got this Council on Global Affairs that's taken place in Chicago. What has actually created that? Where's it come from?
Well, in my experience, when I started covering the Global Cities movement, Brian, in 2015, 2016, for all intents and purposes, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs is the main font of this, the main fountainhead. Now, Ivo Daalder, the former U.S. envoy to NATO, who heads up that organization, remember the Chicago Council on Global Affairs is the former Chicago Council on Foreign Relations. The infamous New York CFR was founded exactly 100 years ago, 1921. The Chicago CFR was founded 1 year later, 1922. So the Chicago Council is a heavy hitter. It's not in the minor leagues, it's in the major leagues. And so their centennial is just around the corner, and they're both connected ideologically and practically to Chatham House in UK. And Ivo Daalder went, as I noted in my article, that by the time people are seeing our broadcast here is probably posted at ukcolumn.org already, or soon will be. There's been sort of a drift from in 2016 when the Global Cities movement really took off and really got some traction. They met in Chicago at the Art Institute Auditorium. And at that time, everything sounded kind of like academic armchair banter. Well, maybe cities need a seat at the table. Maybe we need to be a little more involved in national decision-making and not be left behind, which almost sounds reasonable on one level. But just 2 years later, a little less than that, as I outlined in the article, Daalder went over to Chatham House, and by then they started asking, should cities have their own foreign policy? Now that's a big leap from armchair banter just a little less than 2 years before. For cities to have their own foreign policy means they want to not just have a seat at the table, but they want to usurp powers normally reserved to national governments.
Right. So this is a very significant change, isn't it? Now you're highlighting the Council on Foreign Relations and the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations. If I drop in interest that I've had, that of course Chicago, home to Saul Alinsky as well, is that correct?
Yeah, Chicago's the political wellspring of Hillary Clinton. She comes from there. Barack Obama, Bill Ayers of Weather Underground, him and Bernardine Dohrn were famous for the Weather Underground bombings in the back in the 70s. and Saul Alinsky. There's kind of a radical wellspring there. University of Chicago is Rockefeller money. Quite a bit of radicalism there in terms of globalism and supranationalism, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, it's not surprising then that Chicago would be the hub for global cities, in a way, the worldwide hub. As I mentioned in my article as well, Mayor Rahm, who was in there 2 terms, Rahm Emanuel, who was a chief of staff under the Obama White House, and then made this kind of devolutionary move to become mayor of Chicago. And a lot of people wonder why that was the case. Well, next thing you know, he has the NATO summit there in 2012, earlier in his 2 terms, and Rahm became kind of the global mayor. And Chicagoans were always kind of befuddled by Mayor Rahm. He always seemed to be looking beyond the city, like he was preoccupied with something that transcended city politics. And indeed he was. And it's a little bit lengthy to get into for purposes of today's show. People can read my article at ukcolumn.org. And I can also provide individual copies that to those that might want it, perhaps. But Rahm really set the stage for making Chicago a global city in conjunction with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. So really, Chicago, for all intents and purposes, to answer your question, is the fountainhead of this. They do have connections to Chatham House, as I mentioned, a World Economic Forum. People have often been at Chicago Council meetings. The World Economic Forum, under the COVIDocracy, seems to have become kind of a Bilderberg, open wing of Bilderberg, sort of an executive branch of these think tanks, kind of the one that's giving the orders under Klaus Schwab, while the rest of the think tanks do the heavy hitting, the brainiac grunt work, you might say. And so there seems to be this private government network becoming more and more visible, and COVIDocracy, the whole COVID regime, is providing the grist for the mill for that. It's really the fuel in the tank that's enabling cities to go from armchair banter about having a seat at the table, then talking about having their own foreign policy. And as I mentioned, as recently as last year, a year ago, March 2020, Rahm Emanuel wrote a book, The Nation City, Why Mayors Are Now Running the World. Get that title, The Nation City, Why Mayors Are Now Running the World. Boy, things have come a long way since 2016.
They certainly have. And while you say that, I find myself thinking that Bristol here in the UK has had a lot of problems over the past year. They've had big problems with Black Lives Matter and the pulling down of statues, and I'll say the desecration of history of Bristol as a city. And in the last few days, there's been violence against the police. And yet we've got a man who's traveling to Chicago, the mayor of Bristol, traveling to Chicago to talk about how the world's going to be changed with these city-states, and the mayors are running the world. So it seems to me that we've got exactly the same thing happening in, I think I might have lost you. Are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, your picture's frozen up for some reason. We'll keep going and see whether you come back in. Yeah, so we've got a mayor who's having trouble running his own city, but he's able to travel to the US and discuss how mayors are going to run the world. And I find this very interesting, where we see a sort of disconnect in the mindset of these people at practical level. They're not able to do good. They're not able to do good work in their own city, but then they'll travel and sit on an international stage and discuss saving the world. There's something wrong with the mindset.
Yeah, indeed. It very well may be that Mayor Marvin Rees of Bristol connected virtually by Zoom and remained physically in the UK. I believe, actually, Brian, that's what happened, just to be clear.
Okay, yeah.
Again, the March 18, 2021 meeting of the Pritzker Global Cities Forum was the second one they've done virtually, because they're trying to account for this incredibly contagious, they claim, pandemic, and everything's been focused on that. where the COVID thing is creating the perfect storm, as I noted, for these cities to flex their muscle. And we got to remember that the Global Cities movement basically calls for all these towns, all these major metropolitan areas to adopt globalization schemes and abide by the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, be less concerned or less tuned into national laws, and then the cities network together and form kind of a worldwide grid of global cities. And so globalism is brought in at the local level. A lot of these think tankers actually have a word for it. They call it glocalism. And it's a backdoor way, kind of an underhanded way of, you might say, finishing the globalization process by reorienting cities toward a different ideological worldview. So they're only members of their nation states largely geographically. Philosophically and ideologically, they're increasingly alienated from the nations they inhabit. And now we see under COVID, we see the micro tyrant. We see de Blasio of New York. We see Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, and now Lightfoot, who took over as mayor there. People that are absolutely fanatical about enforcing the lies and the misunderstandings surrounded the coronavirus and COVID-19, and in so doing, using their newfound powers in a very unhinged way to advance the global cities movement. Again, the perfect storm. That's really what's going on here at its essence. And Marvin Rees, speaking to the Chicago Council at the March 18, 2021 Pritzker Global Cities Forum, talked about, how governance needs to be changed. It's in my article, but how cities need to find different ways to operate, because he said something to the effect of, there's no lever that you can pull that will get the appropriate policy change at the national level. Mayors don't have some magic switch they can flip, so they've got to kind of go more on their own. And it creates a real problem in terms of accountability, because like in the US system, the cities and counties are creatures of the states they live in. Not only are they not recognized as having powers that match or exceed the nation state, American cities are not even recognized as having powers that exceed the states they exist in, or even counties. So in other words, a county or a city in the American system is a creature of the state, like Texas or Alabama or Michigan. And then the US Constitution says no state shall enter into foreign compacts with other nations. Well, that would also include subdivisions of the states that would also be forbidden to enter into foreign compacts with other nations without the consent of Congress. See, so at least from the American point of view, it's not even constitutionally legal for cities to act like international ambassadors and pursue their own foreign policy. It's constitutionally prohibited.
And
you're completely tone deaf to that.
Yeah, you see that very clearly, Mark, and it's common sense. If you start to have somebody, I'll say, distracting the leaders of a city to look in another direction other than their own national government for policy, then what is actually happening in a very slow, underhand way is the breakdown of the nation state. We started to see this happening during the European Union years. And how was it done? Well, it was largely done by control of the purse strings. So the moment we were into the European Union, they came up with funding, and the funding might come through the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. It might come through the European Bank, the Central Investment Bank, European Investment Bank, number of different sources, often very big sums of money, and cities were encouraged to bid for funding from the European Union, and the money was allocated on a very generous basis. The biggest requirement from the lenders was that if there was a project undertaken with European money in a British city, then the local authority, the local government system, was beholden to put up big advertising boards to tell the population that the project, the new road or the new building or the new bridge, was funded with European money. And this was a very effective system because, of course, it quickly ended up that we had British cities really clambering over each other to get a bigger slice of the European funding. And their attention was immediately drawn away from central government here in UK to the European funding agencies. The other thing that came on stream with the money is subtle, sometimes not so subtle, policy requirements. So, for example, if you were going to have a refurbished road or road network, then in came the more European sort of road signs and the standardization of the transport. We call it furniture, the signs and lights and other paraphernalia that goes on. That would be adopted in the European style. So the European Union was sort of an iron fist in a velvet glove that started to take power by getting into the cities. And in fact, that system has never gone away. We could talk about Brexit, we won't here. So when you describe the system that American cities are being pulled into and other cities around the world, they're being drawn towards this very attractive, they think, ideology, which says, come with us and be friends with us and we'll give you more power and more prestige, and you will be running your city. Never mind if your government isn't working too hard or not working properly, we're going to support you as the mayor. And so inevitably, as you say, the power of the nation state is just being dismantled.
Yeah, undercut, dismantled. Yeah, in the US, there seems to be a different dynamic, again, with the Chicago Council being the apparent nexus of this, and Rahm Emanuel during his 2 terms sort of bringing this to the next level and setting the stage for what we're seeing now. It seems to be all private money from what I've seen so far, Brian. The amazingly wealthy Lester Crown family of General Dynamics fame, the incredibly wealthy Pritzker family, the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, and some other miscellaneous foundations and charitable outlets and whatnot that are bequeathing money for this so Evil Dalder can run this. And in the US, under the World Affairs Councils of America, or WACA, there are some 90 or so World Affairs Councils that are similar to the Chicago Council. Some of them smaller and regional, some of them larger, like in Houston, Dallas, and whatnot, Los Angeles. And these World Affairs Councils form this pretty tight network through all the major metropolitan areas in the US. And there's some similar things in Canada where this private money can flow. And one way or another, they're all talking the language, if not pursuing the policy of global cities. They see it as a form of, kind of defecting from the nation state. This is not to say that nation states are perfect. This is not to say that all city policies are necessarily stupid or something, or that cities couldn't come up with a better idea than federal agencies. This is not to say that. On the one level, local control, improving local control sounds attractive. The difference here is the context. The local control these global cities are talking about is just a shift or reorientation toward globalism, again, largely abiding by sustainable development goals, because one of the main features of global cities is to create a lot of open areas, open spaces, green energy technology for producing electricity. Rahm Emanuel closed 2 coal-fired plants when he was mayor to kind of pave the way, again, for more green energy, green open spaces, improved mass transit with less emissions in the atmosphere, smart buildings that produce their own solar and wind power and are almost energy independent in and of themselves, all sorts of gizmos and gadgets, some of it even agreeable on a piecemeal basis. But you look at the context and it's It's about plugging into the World Economic Forum, plugging into the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and unplugging in the process from individual nation states, however imperfect those nation states may be. And granted, they need a lot of work here and abroad, but that's essentially how it works. And COVID is just a runaway freight train for them to speed up this process and adopt more powers and change their political position in the world.
Yes, and am I right? I can talk with experience of UK, but what is it like in America? We see that the local voters are simply not told the full picture. So somebody standing for election will say that they're going to champion environmental matters in the city. What they won't be saying is that that actually is one of the core policies for creating green cities, and that is part of a global agenda. So locally, the voters are deceived because they're only given part of the picture as to what's happening with the city. So we've seen some very glossy magazines and brochures come out across UK talking about the smart cities, and it's sold that Bristol, or I think Sheffield is another one, maybe wrong on that one, but there's a number of them that they were going to be promoted as smart cities, and inevitably with that promotion they were going to get on a particular funding gravy train to help this transition into the smart city. But of course, people locally simply not told that the smart city agenda is part of the global city agenda. So they're kept dumbed down. So I've thrown in a couple of them there. We've got green cities, we've got global cities. Future cities is another term that I've heard. That's a bit more woolly in what it actually means, but it sounds good, doesn't it? If Plymouth or Bristol is going to become a future city, we're looking to the future. So there is a change in the language that's being used. And it seems to me that this language is very much being used to steer the people who they bring on board with the global cities agenda. It mesmerizes them in a way. They begin to only think about how the city will be in the future. They don't think about the problems on the streets today. Don't worry about the problems today, because in the future, if we get our smart city right, it will all be okay.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And what you described is very true. On an individual level, you see these resilient cities, smart cities, global cities, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of people will think, well, that's just this town at just this time, that it's a separate event, isolated from any larger context. But what they're not told, as you said, is that there is a larger context, and that cities the world over, via the Global Parliament of Mayors, especially through the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and other cities, Mayor Garcetti's Los Angeles and whatnot, LaToya Cantrell's New Orleans, these mayors that spoke at this most recent Chicago Global Cities Forum, they're all talking the same language, but their residents, if they hear this, will think it only applies to their town. And what's really ironic about the Global Cities movement, well, like Bilderberg, you have reporters that take part in the Chicago Council's Pritzker Forum on Global Cities, which is Financial Times reporters, Gillian Tett, Edward Luce, and Peter Spiegel. But they don't cover the event. They don't report on the event. They take part in the event. That's really a no-no journalistically. And that is across the board. There are no reporters, and it's just sort of an ironic little track that I fell into, but by no special means, I just did. I'm like the only reporter by happenstance purely that's really covering this consistently. And I'm not saying that as a boastful thing. It's just a circumstantial thing that just came about, because what reporters there are that are involved in it are collaborating with the oligarchs and the think tankers and not staying detached and reporting on the event. Therefore, there are no consistent, really no reports at all in the mass media cartel, the mainstream press, about this. Therefore, people don't know about the larger context that you and I are both referring to. Ergo, when they do get wind of the Windy City or some other city going global, they think, well, that's just some special thing only our city is doing. And so the lack of press coverage combined with major media like the Financial Times actually being collaborators, is creating this kind of double-blind situation.
Yeah, and my mind's taken back to when I was looking at matters to do with fraud and corruption and European Union money. I'll say about 15 years ago, and I started out looking at Plymouth, but I soon found plenty of people talking about similar problems in other UK cities. But I then was able, at the time, I was working with the Chamber of Commerce. I was actually on the board of Plymouth Chamber of Commerce. I thought that was a good thing at the time. I might have changed my ideas now, but it was interesting to rub shoulders with, obviously, people within the business community. But it gave me a very good insight into policy coming into the city, some of which was discussed with the Chamber of Commerce. I'll just drop in very quickly that one of the organisations that was holding a lot of power under the surface, and I was not initially aware of that, this organisation was Common Purpose, the charity, the political charity Common Purpose. But it was very interesting being in the mix and seeing what was going on. And I was always fascinated when policy documents appeared. They would usually be stamped with the City Council's logo, Plymouth City Council, and they would be talking about all these issues, greening the city, improving transport, making the city smarter. All these buzzwords and terms were used. And then I became very curious as to where the policy had come from. Now, some of it you could track back through to the UK, but I have to say, even in those early days when I didn't really get the full picture, I was surprised to see so many quotes to sustainable development projects, to the United Nations. So
Right.
you were seeing in a local city's documentation reference to organisations. You'd think, well, why is Plymouth City Council talking about what the UN is saying? The UN's a global organisation and way above Plymouth City Council's pay grades, but here were the references. Here were the references to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And now I can look back and see that it was like this spider's web being constructed a piece at a time. And that agenda, it was like osmosis. It was sucked into the fabric of the city, and then bits of it were implemented. Now, to answer really your point about the journalists, in this era, there was a particular journalist who was doing some very good work. And he would occasionally give some very good information. And one day there was a phone call. This particular person was on the phone, and they said, "I've just been in the most scary meeting ever." That was the term used. It was scary. And what was the problem? You know, what went on? Well, it was all about how the city would be in the future and how it would be divided up into sectors, and how different classes of people would be able to live in different sectors. And what was really scary about it, Brian, was that they were using this, what the person described as quasi-military language, districts, sectors. In the journalist's mind, the language was not the language of a local council, it was the language of a sort of semi-military organization. And he said, I didn't like it, I was just uncomfortable. And then they said, well, one of the things, of course, we know is some people are not going to agree with this new system of running a city, but don't worry, because there's going to be special areas for the dissenters. Now, this was told to me back 15 years ago, and the icing on the cake was Tony Blair, the infamous British Prime Minister, was actually in Plymouth at that time. And apparently one of the local authorities said in his presence, well, the trouble is we're finding it quite difficult to implement some of these agendas. To which Tony Blair said, well, you have been given special powers and you should use them. And if you now say to me, Brian, what were those special powers? I have to guess and read between the lines a bit, but I think they were the powers where we start to see the city council not acting as a democratic authority to do the wishes of the electorate. We were starting to see the city council wield its muscles to tell people how they were going to live.
Exactly. And the COVID thing, as covered in this March 2021 Pritzker Forum on Global Cities, sponsored by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, telling people how they're going to live is really, COVID is really enabling them to do that. There was this monolithic viewpoint with no dissent allowed, no dissent detectable throughout the whole Pritzker Forum. And they went along talking about, again, how to equitably push out this vaccine. And all of it was just in lockstep with national and international policies, not really defying the nation state, but in this case, going along with the Biden regime here in America. Marcella Nunez-Smith, who I referred to earlier, talking to Ed Luce, she came out of Yale and she's with Biden's healthcare task force under the DHHS at the federal level. And she talked a lot about, well, there's misinformation and disinformation out there that are going to spoil the apple cart if we're not careful in terms of equitably distributing vaccines within and among nations. So the poor and the not so poor get them at the same time. We've got to really ramp this up. This authoritarianism just goes hand in hand with the COVID issue. And so they're pushing it with all their might. They don't want to hear anything about misinformation, disinformation, or naysayers. There's no mention of something like 17 to 1,800 suspected COVID vaccine deaths, probably in the US alone, as the VAERS system run by the CDC and the FDA itself has reported as of March 11th, 2021. And remember, that's the CDC and FDA's own passive reporting system, VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Effects Reporting System. So this number is staring everybody in the face, and it's been re-reported by the National Vaccine Information Center and Health Impact News and Robert F. Kennedy's outfit, the Children's Health Defense. They've been putting these VAERS numbers out there, and yet the Chicago Pritzker Forum makes no mention, not even an inkling, that there were also over 34,000 adverse effects reported. And yes, they're not all proven to be caused by the vaccines, over 1,700 deaths, over 34,000 adverse effects. But the thing is that 9-10 years ago, when there was the swine flu, and then back in the mid 70s in the US, when I believe it was also swine flu, Eureka, right? There was only a little bit of a problem with vaccinations, and they would have a tendency to halt the vaccinations. Now, no matter how many adverse effects and deaths are being reported, suspected or actual, they're not only not suspending the vaccination regime, they're accelerating it. And the Global Cities movement is really a sort of a central gear in the overall gearbox of accelerating this thing to get it to poorer nations as well as poorer communities within nations. And that really enveloped their whole forum here in March 2021. It was pretty much all about how wonderful the vaccines are. The only problem is people aren't getting them fast enough. And when Marvin Reese said he wanted to empower the citizenry, Marvin Reese, the Bristol mayor, his version of empowerment was to get people to understand that the COVID virus is spread through droplets, through your exhalations and through your saliva or sneezing, or through shared surfaces. And if people would only understand that principle, that would empower the people to make the right decision. These are almost his exact words. But you'll notice that to him, empowerment means to believe a single narrative that all these global mayors agree on, and to believe that narrative unquestionably and to live by that narrative, when in fact there are other doctors the world over that are being shut out of the mass media cartel that will tell a far different story, including that the caseload that we keep hearing about, these high case numbers for COVID, are really a result of the flawed and unreliable PCR test, the most widely used test that is so sensitive. It detects such minute amounts of bacteria, of biological material in the human system, that it mistakes all sorts of things like colds you used to have and flus you used to have and different things within your biochemistry. It detects these things and labels them COVID. So the heavy caseload is really from a lot of false positives and misreadings and unreliable test results from the PCR test, not because droplets are spread hither and yon and everybody that comes within even a few feet of somebody is automatically picking up the virus.
Right,
No,
right, just
there's a completely different point of view out there.
yeah. Let's just, I got to say, let's just focus this a bit. You're getting passionate and quite rightly about this because you're seeing this picture, this jigsaw coming together in your head. Just for people who might have come into this a bit new, we've started off, we've been talking about global cities and how we are seeing a drive for a global city system. And
Right.
that is breaking down the nation state. And you can sit and look at the pieces and say, well, if we end up with a network of thousands of city states across the world, and nation states have dropped into the background, who's going to be controlling those city states? That's a key question we'll come on to in a minute. But we're seeing this policy for creating the city states and undermining the nation state. And then what you are focusing on is the fact that COVID has been such an effective tool to help them speed up and to propagate this agenda towards the global city. You're saying that. You're also saying that within the COVID-19 pandemic scenario, you're seeing them using a common language and a common descriptor of things in order to really capture people's minds and drive them down the route of really more draconian controls all the time. Now, what was I doing this morning? What I was doing this morning was challenging the National Health Service here in UK and the government health department over the fact that we have statistics. You've talked about the VIIRS. Is it VIIRS or VIIR system?
VIIRS, VAERS.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. It's VIIRS. About the VIIRS system, well, we have an equivalent organisation, which is the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Authority here in UK, MHRA. That has been running a yellow card system, which has been collecting the data, the statistics of adverse effects of the vaccines. And within their collected data, we have truly horrible things. We have people dying. We have people paralyzed. We have people going blind, people going deaf, people having major neurological problems so they can't walk, cardiac problems, thrombosis, skin problems. These are all now available to the public. You can call up the spreadsheets with this information, but these are serious side effects. And yet nobody is talking about them. The BBC is not talking about them. The major UK newspapers are not talking about these very nasty statistics, adverse effects of the vaccines. And yes, within the cities, we see them bending over backwards to implement further lockdown. I prefer to call it a curfew, to stop people meeting with their families, to stop them visiting elderly relatives in care homes, to stop you going out your front door, to stop you exercising. So we also see the use of increasing use of draconian COVID powers, which are, I'm going to use the word deliberately, transforming society in something which is almost unrecognizable from even thinking back 3 years, maybe. And you're doing this while suppressing the reality of the people who've died or been maimed of these COVID side effects. And so I had an interesting time this morning challenging these departments And they were becoming very nervous of me, because when they said, well, can we ask why you are asking about this? I said, yes, I'll tell you, I'm quite happy to tell you, because I'm being contacted by a lot of members of the public whose family members, husbands, wives, relatives, colleagues are now incapacitated in hospital with serious COVID side effects. And they're contacting me. Well, the moment I said that, you could hear the press people start to wobble on the other end of the phone, because I was there thrusting in a sharp stick when other people are not mentioning it. So isn't it strange? In America and UK, we are seeing both sides of the Atlantic the use of this so-called COVID pandemic to drive political and social change.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the numbers that I already gave out of VAERS and the numbers you gave out of your equivalent agency are exactly the numbers the mainstream press and the think tankers and the global cities acolytes are papering over and ignoring, hoping to herd everyone into cities. When I first covered the Global Cities Forum in Chicago in 2016, Dan Glickman, a US agricultural official at that time, said by 2040 or 2050, a very high number of the American electorate, the American citizenry, would be expected to be living in cities or metropolitan areas, that there would be fewer and fewer urban land dwellers. And so this is the stack and pack future that they foresee. But now they foresee cities being at the vanguard of adopting all these national-like powers and using COVID to tightly control populations within cities that they expect to have more and more people as time goes by. Of course, there's a little bit of an irony there. New York City actually lost some of its population from all the businesses closing. Some other cities have been ruptured by the COVID crackdown and actually lost some people that actually moved out of the cities. So some of this might be backfiring on them a little in some respects. But the bottom line is they don't want to talk about these uncomfortable numbers that you and I are both inquiring about, so they can make this argument that minorities don't want to be left behind. More of them are dying of COVID supposedly, so they need the vaccines. We got to do it within nations and among nations. There, no country, no neighborhood, no ethnicity should be left behind. They all need to get these vaccines. And this health regime that's grown up around this is truly scary. This notion that there's one way and only one way to treat or prevent illness, when we know by common sense that good hydration, good nutrition, getting plenty of sunshine, being around family, having human contact, certain supplements that you might need, and then your therapeutics that were briefly mentioned at the Chicago Pritzker Global Cities Forum, but then kind of put aside as just a tangential thing or a something not that important. It's vaccines, and it's just amazing the way these things are pushed, and the way that they're being ginned up, and they say that they want to empower minorities. And the way they want to empower minorities is not to inform them that the vaccines have some hazards and dangers, or anyone else for that matter. Don't inform anyone. Simply serve the minorities who are supposedly dying more from COVID by giving them the vaccines. That's how you address their concerns. That's how you balance any racial or ethnic disparities. And you'll notice the Orwellian premise behind that. All of that, as I wrote in my article on this Global Cities Forum, all of that is based on this premise that the vaccines are safe. But what if they're not? Then this racial equity that they're pursuing under the title of this year's forum, Pursuing Equity, this equity would end up being giving people vaccines that might lead to deaths and debilitating health effects within these minorities that they say they're going to rescue. Well, so this is the Orwellian irony here, is that they're bound to hurt the very minorities that they say they want to help in their pursuit of equity.
I think we can say with quite a lot of confidence, Mark, that we're very often seeing that whatever language is used on whatever subject, whether it's to do with sort of money or helping communities or protecting children or making cities greener, whatever they say they're doing, the effect of, or what actually transpires, what and the effect is always the opposite, is 180 degrees out. If they say they're helping people, they're destroying people. And I will say quite happy, well, I can't use the term happy because it's such a dark subject, but I have people now asking me, do I believe that the government in the United Kingdom is killing elderly people? And I absolutely believe that that is what is going on. Elderly people are being culled. They were killed off under a program called the Liverpool Care Pathway, where life support and sustenance, food and water was withdrawn from elderly people, and they died in their tens, hundreds of thousands in UK, until some of it broke surface and the government said that this particular system of, quote, end of life care would be stopped. But in fact, it was never stopped. It carried on in other forms. And the UK column, and in particular, work on the statistics done by Mike Robinson from the UK column, has clearly shown that the massive spike in the deaths of elderly people in UK has been the result of lockdown. It is locking the elderly people down in facilities, often with not much fresh air, where they are dehydrating and getting depressed. And then what did the government do? It took elderly people who they knew had COVID, they took them out the hospitals and put them into the clean, virus-free care homes, where, surprise, surprise, elderly people got COVID. And now we're vaccinating those elderly people. And what do the statistics show? Well, there's a surprising correlation with the fact that many of the people vaccinated suddenly got COVID. So what is going on? What do I think is going on? I think elderly people are being culled, and they are being culled because this ultimately saves the government billions and billions of pounds in pension funds and all the healthcare costs. But of course, you want to get rid of the older generation, because the older generation is the generation that remembers what life was like and how life should be. So you don't want young children mixing with granddad and grandpa in order to learn about how life was and how it should be. You want those elderly people dead. And that is the agenda. And if people think that I'm being extreme in saying this, to me, the evidence is right in front of our faces. So the people developing the policies to create these city states are not going to create benevolent city states. These are going to be something like we've never seen before.
Certainly, de Blasio in New York and governors like Andrew Cuomo in New York, de Blasio's New York City, or Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, both Cuomo and Whitmer were guilty of the same thing by all indications of putting who were apparently COVID-infected people out of hospitals and into nursing homes, and then spreading the virus, evidently knowingly and willfully. So you've got two state governors, at least in Michigan, that have been accused of that same thing, but have not paid the price. The only thing that came up against Andrew Cuomo was some sort of skirt chasing, womanizing allegations. We've seen that a million times before. That might even be a distraction that he cooked up himself to take the people's mind off the COVID nursing home thing. So you see similar things going on here, Brian. But clearly the vaccine regime and the COVID regime is the perfect thing. It used to be, as I outlined in my article about this matter that's on the UKC website, as I understand it, or soon will be, there used to be only climate change and sundry issues like that that were the boogeyman or the big monster, the Godzilla on the other side of the mountain. But they just weren't convincing enough. They weren't galvanizing enough. But COVID is getting into individual people's lives in a big, intimate way. And so they've really got something they don't want to let go of. And these numbers you and I are talking about suspected vax deaths and adverse reactions, some of them very serious and lifelong, this information they do not want out. Hence the monolithic narrative at the Global Cities Forum most recently and in the past. No variation in the theme, especially when COVID came along. and it was monolithic enough even before COVID. It's a one-size-fits-all worldview. And by changing the cities, the character of the cities, and they're saying that some 80% of Americans live in cities already. I'm not sure that number's right. They figure that if the cities are globalized, then 70, 80% of the people living in the country also are living in that globalized environment, you see. So it kind of prepares everyone or brainwashes everyone to look at everything through that same lens, since most people are living in metropolitan areas. Yes. And so this is the mass re-education that this helps bring about, along with all the surveillance and all the other things. And of course, the greening of our cities and green jobs and the whole climate change thing is still there. It's just that COVID provided the perfect supplement to leverage all this power and reorient this power the way the global cities are.
Yeah. Now, if I may, I just wanted, people will be thinking this is very dark, this is very heavy. Some people are going to find it quite depressing. Certainly some are going to say that it's frightening. It's a frightening scenario. Is it real? I absolutely believe it is real. We've got a malevolent agenda being created by some truly wicked people, and they're driving it forward very quickly. They've got all the money. That's one of the reasons that they can do a lot of the things they can do.
Right.
But I'm seeing a very interesting backlash in UK, which has come about through the unfortunate route of the people who have now been hurt by the vaccines. And I'd just like to read out a few lines of an email that I sent off to the National Health Service here in England this morning. Mm-hmm. So the headline was "Background. As a journalist, I'm being contacted by a range of people reporting serious vaccine adverse effects experienced personally and or by relatives, friends and work colleagues. The adverse effects include death, together with serious neurological issues, anaphylaxis, and other severe medical conditions necessitating both intensive care and specialist hospital treatment. The individuals state that at no time were they warned of such adverse effects before having the vaccine, and their claims appear correct in that neither the National Health Service nor the vaccination centre teams are warning of any adverse effects over and above the more minor issues of vaccine site irritation and feeling what we call poorly, slightly unwell here in UK. This tragic list of damaged individuals is the human side of the MHRA vaccine adverse reaction data, which clearly indicates a vast range of both serious and more minor post-vaccine adverse reactions as recorded to date. The direct concerns of these individuals is reinforced by NHS professionals who are also, that's doctors and nurses, who are also coming forward to warn of the intake of vaccine damaged patients. So that was my introduction to me, then asking them why they're not talking about adverse effects. I have, over the last week, had a steady stream of people coming to the UK column, speaking to me. One very brave lady has done a complete interview, which we will be making public, talking about how relatives have been severely damaged, physically, mentally damaged as a result of the vaccines. But the British government does not want to talk about these side effects, and the city authorities do not want to talk about these side effects. So this has got to be a malevolent system which is coming into power. There's no question of it. But we're also seeing people, we're using here a term mesmerized. We're seeing people who seem unable to think, unable to look at very clear data. People are being hurt, a lot of them, and realizing that if those people are being hurt, in due course, they're going to be hurt. It's like their brains are trapped in a mush, in a swamp. Do you see a similar inability of the US public to see through these policies as they're coming online?
Absolutely. Here in Texas and in Florida, which are supposed to be the most free and open states, which in some respects they are, and I'm glad for that. But even when Greg Abbott on March 10th, 2021, the Texas governor removed the mask mandate, the private businesses, grocery stores, Walmarts, whatnot, many of them actually made masking even stricter. So they kind of disregard the governor at the county and city level. See, there's some of that kind of rebellion going on between governmental levels. And yet amongst the general population, you see heavy masking still, and people seem unwilling to hear what the governor said and actually say, well, like South Dakota, we could just, those that want a mask can wear it. Those that don't want to, don't have to. Live and let live, to each his own, and just go about our lives. But it's not quite happening that way, even though it should be. And so there is this lockstep, which is the ironic name of a Rockefeller study that many believe led up to this. There is this lockstep that it's hard to get out of people's minds, because the COVID crackdown at one level or another in one country or another has been about a year now, about a year old, March 2020 to March 2021. And a year's time has been enough time to really get people goose stepping to the COVID tune, you might say. And it's really hard to get people out of the habit. They've learned to love their servitude, as Aldous Huxley and other dystopian writers like Orwell warned. It becomes an article of faith. It becomes something you perversely love, kind of like Stockholm syndrome, where the jailed begin to have affection for the jailer. And so this is the psychological phenomenon we see. People put into sort of a self-imposed bondage, because a lot of the gubernatorial and executive decrees at the national and state level here really had no lawful basis. They were just declarations, decrees, edicts that were unlawful, unconstitutional, and meaningless. But people have been led to believe that any old thing that some governor barks out or is cooked up by some legislature is automatically valid law. And that's just not true. They've lost all sight of civics, of how government is supposed to work, what's really lawful and what isn't. All that's been swept away. And now the cities can take advantage, with so much of the population living within or near their borders. They can take advantage of this slothful kind of, inactive, compliant point of view, this compliant mindset. They can take advantage of that and push forward, with a large part of the population being in tow, being, taken along down the primrose path.
Right. No.
It's an amazing thing to see, but there is an upside. If you want to talk about it, there is a sizable number. I was on alternate current radio with Hesher recently, and that's based in Temple, Texas. And there's still something like 30 to 50% of Americans that are hesitant at one level or degree to another about getting the jab. And this hesitancy was mentioned at the Global Cities Forum, the most recent one I covered, by the keynote speaker, Dr. Fauci, the America's doctor, by other panelists. And so the hesitancy is there. They want to get around it and get around it as fast as they can and get that jab into as many people's arms as possible. Even the Texas governor just yesterday, today being March 24, yesterday on March 23rd, today being March 26th, yesterday being March 25th, pardon me, the Texas governor was in South Texas, sounding very tyrannical, pushing the vaccine for all it's worth. It probably has something to do with those that donated to his $40 million reelection campaign fund and its payback time to some of his donors. But at any rate, even in relatively free states, we're having a really tough time getting around this conformity and this passive mindset that you talked about, Brian.
Yeah. Well, hopefully our discussion is going to help some people to understand what's happening. I've described COVID as a smokescreen. COVID is the smokescreen that difficult to see through. It's all a bit vague and misty. And we've got to watch for the policies that are being implemented under the cover of COVID. I've got an eye on the clock here, Mark. So I'm going to say, I think we need probably to end, but I just wanted to read your final paragraph from your excellent article all about this subject of the global mayors and the city states, and we will make sure that that is there for people to see on the UK Column website. We'll make sure that we point to it. But this was your final paragraph. Yet, one overarching thing became crystal clear at the 2021 Pritzker Forum on Global Cities. The event's monolithic narrative management, where dissent is non-existent, and the unwavering lust to advance a medical regime using a gene-altering mRNA virtual vaccine that's never been used on mass populations before, will indeed lead to equitable tyranny for all, regardless of race or place. And I read that paragraph and I thought, my goodness, Mark summed that up to a treat, because this policy, including the pandemic and the vaccines and the lockdowns and the curfews, this is leading us to a tyranny, and most people should be able to see it. And if they'd only pull themselves away from the TV and the mainstream mass media, they would have a better picture. So, Mark, how would you leave the audience today? What would you like to see people do to try and break us out of this mesmerized state?
Well, I would note that if this is what it looks like en route to full-blown global cities, and we're not even there yet, imagine how bad it'll be once we're all the way there. This is just the route to that. So with that in mind, certainly there needs to be strong support for alternative media like ourselves to overcome the mass media cartel, to challenge their hegemony. And at the same time, we need to get out in the streets, as has been done in London and in some more limited venues in the States, and be much more consistent with that. Be peaceful, but be consistent. There needs to be frequent demonstrations pointing out the fallacy of these pro-vaccine statistics and the cover-ups of the deaths and the huge degradation and injuries and adverse effects. It needs to be a steady, ongoing movement to expose the media's complicity, to expose the movement toward global cities, to show the real data, to make the calls like you're doing, Brian, to national health authorities. We can all call our county and local health departments and ask them why they're not getting the adverse effects and deaths of vaccines, suspected or actual, why they're not giving us a balanced view. Call up the media outlets, berate them a little bit. I myself have got signage and picketing that I take out in front of media outlets, telling motorists and passersby, highlighting that the media is not giving them the whole story. It's just going to take a full court press of real citizen activism and citizen journalism and independent journalism, and doing it steadily and unrelentingly, I should say, to get the message out there. These are the times that try men's souls, as Thomas Paine said in the American Revolution, and it's certainly true. We have to have some freedom left in order to win back the freedoms we've been lost. So we have to move quickly. We are at a bellwether moment in history, and we have to take advantage of it. This is the time to get involved at whatever level you can. And we all work together, and I believe we'll prevail. But we have to be recognizing what's before us. And I'll end with this. The Global Cities movement and the coronavirus, whatever its exact reality, has done us one favor. It's exposed just how tyrannical our politicians are willing to be at the local, state, and national levels. It exposes just how far they're willing to go, just how duplicitous they're willing to be. And it's showing just how dissolved and basically almost non-existent our assumed government structures are. We're being given the bitter truth that we have to kind of reestablish our own governing structures and reestablish society, almost like starting over again in several respects. And it's a daunting task, but at least it's done us the favor of giving us the true score, so we know what's going on, because a proper prognosis leads to a proper solution. So it's an uphill battle, but it's a battle worth fighting.
Yeah, Mark, excellent. And I can't really add anything to that, but I'll reinforce one thing. A man said to me the other day, the silver lining is the fact we can now see the enemy. They've come in through the gates. We had great difficulty. Who were they? But it's becoming more and more easy to see who they are, because you just see who is rubber stamping the policy, the people speaking the policy, the people making it happen, that malevolent policy. We can see who these individuals are by what they do and what they say. Whereas before we couldn't quite see them because they were maneuvering under the surface. So we'll leave it there. Mark, it's been a brilliant discussion. I hope we got people interested to dig deeper if you didn't know too much about the global mayor system. And I'm going to suggest that perhaps we ought to have a talk in the fairly shortly, talking about this use of what I'm going to call hypnotic language, with the new speak that we're seeing come through all these organizations, the mincing of words, the changing of the meaning of words in order to get this new transformational agenda into place. I think we need to talk about that. And we also need to talk about the use of applied psychology on populations, because it's quite clear that a lot of that wicked practice has come straight out of the UK, I'm afraid to say. All right, well, Mark, thank you very much. And we'll leave it there. And I look forward to having you back onto the UK column again in the future.
Oh, you're welcome, Brian. I enjoyed it as always. Good stuff.